All right, so I'm here to talk about pattern libraries. I don't know. So I work at Oddbird. We're releasing a pattern library generator, and I'm not going to talk about it because I had no time to prep. So I'm going to talk about the tool we're trying to get rid of instead. So let's do that. It's just another grid system. That's really it. That's all. Thank you. So instead of just talking about grid systems, I'm going to go back and talk a little bit about the history of web layouts, a little bit of a flashback. Remember tables? Some of us used to use those. How many of you use those in production? Yeah, all right. I got started right as those were on their way out. This is me starting my company in '94 with my brothers. I think we're playing Magic the Gathering there. I mean, we're doing a card sort. We're definitely planning out an interaction. We started a company. It was right at the end of tables. We were just starting to use CSS. I picked the most grainy image I could find for tables because that seemed appropriate. We all know tables are for data. There were some problems with that as a layout tool. Strict nonlinear markup. Limited styling, there's sort of things you can't do with tables, a lot of limitations, accessibility nightmare, when used for layout, not when used for data. Also SEO and legal problems, so if you're not going to do it for people, do it for the robot lawyers. And then the problem that Sarah Drasner talks about a lot, code is communication. And tables don't communicate. When we mark things up in tables, we can't look at it and understand what we're going to see because we end up having things out of order. So we're trying to figure out a way to do layouts that are meaningful to humans and machines. That's sort of the goal of our code always, is can we make it so that both the machine understands it and people who look at it are going to understand it. And table layouts destroy that. And this is all old, you know this. Get rid of the tables. So chapter 2, CSS is awesome, and oh, that's it. You've all seen this. CSS is awesome. This is a feature, and you need to know that. If your design tool couldn't do this, you would be pissed. If you ask for a small box with large text, it's going to overflow the box. That's something that a design tool should be able to do, and CSS is a design tool, and CSS can do that. If you don't want that to happen, you have to be less explicit, and that's part of how the web works. Just because CSS is declarative doesn't mean that it's static. We're designing things that are going to move and change depending on various factors. And if we don't plan for that change, if we get too explicit, saying exact sizes and exact font sizes and exact layout sizes, things are going to start to break. So declarative does not mean simple or static. We're building dynamic relationships. We're trying to think through, are things going to change when the content changes? How is height and width going to affect things? When the viewport changes, ratios and small screens to large screens. When the context changes, where we are in the cascade, if a widget moves around. We're trying to design implicit relationships that will move in relation to each other, and we're designing those relationships rather than the specific look, because we don't know what the client's browser is going to be and what their device is going to be. Lots of factors, so we need to design for the relationships rather than the specific outcomes. Client has control over the web, and that's not just your boss, the client that hired you, paying you. That's the client side, the browser, because the web looks something like this, and you can't design for each of those. Which is a good reminder that you're not designing just for one orange guy with gold hair. There's a lot of people out there. They're all different. You got to design for all of them. So let's talk about sort of general layout concepts, because this is definitely a layout conference, and that's what we're getting into. I think one of the most important things to understand in layouts is the box model. You've probably seen it before, and it's broken by default. This is the default content box model. This is what we got in early Netscape. IE got it right and then had to fix it so it's wrong now. The width and height that you set define the width and height of the content, not of the box as a whole. Padding and borders are added to that, and it gets confusing if you're trying to do a layout. So this has some limited uses. There are times that that's useful, where you want to say, this is the size of my content. Now please expand out according to that. It's useful on certain types of containers. But broadly, this is going to be more helpful, being able to define the height and width of the entire box, and then have borders and padding and content subtracted from that. So the very first thing I do when I start a new project is I fix it. This is just a couple lines of code that just fixes the box model. You may have also seen this version of it, which uses inheritance. I'd avoid it. There's a reason box models don't inherit. There's a reason margins don't inherit. Layout elements shouldn't inherit. Children elements don't always need the same layout as their parents. That makes sense. So there's very limited uses where you might want to inherit the box model if you're trying to switch it for a section of the site that's loading old code or something like that. But generally, I wouldn't inherit the box model. The other thing that I think about a lot, and is one of my main rules when I'm working with layout, is to go with a flow. Stick with the flow whenever we can. So the flow is this. When we have several items, they stack up next to each other. I have them floated. And if this one changes, the others move to give it space. And that's the flow. And it's useful because it helps us design implicit relationships rather than explicit layouts. And CodePen breaks my slides. So using the flow helps us avoid tightly coupled elements so that our components can respond to unexpected changes around them without being too set in their ways. So if we took all those elements out of the flow and placed them statically, suddenly when this one changes size for some reason, the content got bigger, somebody put a bigger headline in there, nothing else moves, and now we have to fix the rest of the page because there was one change here. So taking things out of the flow often means it's a more fragile layout, and we're going to have to change more things when we change one thing, which is what we don't want. It's a maintainability problem. Yeah, you can see this is the wrong demo. What I really should demo, here we've got, like, I can show a sidebar. Right now it's not in the flow, but I can make it in the flow. And you can see the difference there. This actually shows where both can be useful. If you want to see two things at once, put them in the flow. If you want one to overlay the other, take it out of the flow. That's when it's useful to take things out of the flow, is when we've got overlays and things that aren't actually part of the layout with other elements. What I really should have shown here is what happens if you need to make the logo bigger. And if you've set too many explicit relationships, making the logo bigger breaks the layout, and you're in trouble. You definitely should make the logo bigger and get rid of that white space. So positioning, when I first came to CSS, I thought, oh, obviously we're doing layouts. Position, that's going to do it, right? Position is how you would do a layout. It doesn't work. Position relative just sort of pushes things around. in a weird way. Does anybody use position relative for anything other than setting context? No, no hands in the entire room. Great. So at this point, most of us, if we need to do this, we use transforms, but position relative is there, so we can transform translate now and get some other bonuses with that. So really only using position relative for establishing context, and that's establishing context for position absolute, which we can use more often, but this pulls things out of the flow and becomes useful mainly for overlays and other things. You can also position to the viewport using fixed or do a mix using sticky, but really just for overlays. Once we start positioning things absolutely, they're out of the flow and we have to force things around them unless we're just allowing them to overlay what's there. So, floats. This is what we have used for years. And they're great at pushing an image to the side and letting text wrap around it. They do that really well. It kind of flows. It's like not really part of the flow, but it's kind of part of the flow. There's a few things that are flowing around it, like text, and then this other floating element flows around it, but the container doesn't, and the box doesn't. So it's just sort of a weird mix. And it's a perfect mix for doing this. We want the text to go around it. Great, done. But if we want anything else to go around it, we start using a clear fix, and we've all used this, and there's just simple utility classes or mix-ins or whatever you like to use. There's a micro one there. And suddenly, this is all it does. I just made the clear fix visible down at the bottom. It just adds an element that says, hey, clear me. That gets the container wrapping, still not this other one. We now have display flow root, which is like clear fix built into the browser. And by we now have, I mean there's no chance you're using this in production, and keep using your clear fix. I don't know, it's great that now that we're like using floats less, we finally have a spec way to actually deal with them. The other little trick is overflow hidden. I think I learned this from Nicole Sullivan back in the day, which does some interesting things when interacting with floats. It works as a clear fix, but it comes with risks where, you know, overflow is hidden, and that can be risky. But using the overflow hack, this other element now flows around it, and the container also does. So overflow hidden is a nifty trick when you're dealing with floats. And in OOCSS, Nicole uses it to create a last column that's fluid and fits into whatever space is remaining, which is a pretty clever solution. It's not the worst hack. We've used worse hacks, so great. The markup is pretty flexible. I like that. I can have weird nested, like I can have all these divs that JavaScript gives me. Hey, stop giving me all these divs in JavaScript. I don't want them. But I can have them all there, and with floats, they'll just all disappear because I don't put a clear fix on them, and they just collapse away. And that's handy. That's a thing that I like about floats. Downside, you pretty much always have to set explicit widths, because floats otherwise kind of don't know where they're supposed to go. And that sort of breaks the idea that we want implicit relationships rather than explicit outcomes. There used to be this subpixel rounding problem. I wouldn't worry about it much anymore unless you're supporting very old browsers. The problem was this in 2008. This is a demo by John Ressig. And you can see just if you divide 50 pixels into 4, what do you get? You get rounding errors. And each browser handled that differently for a while. And some people came up with this clever way of doing subpixel isolation to make those problems go away. Those red lines that appear are when you get rounding errors. And now you can see that actually the browser is handling it better up top than the subpixel isolation technique is handling it below. So at this point, there's no reason to worry about that. If you've been using that, you can let it go. Backgrounds still have subpixel rounding images. I don't know why browsers don't care about this issue on the background, but there it is. That's not going to affect your layout. That's going to affect your design. After people started using floats, inline block became popular briefly, I think. I wouldn't bother. It's invasive. There's lots of little weird hacks that you have to do, changing font sizes, trying to get rid of white space. It's really more bother than it's worth, except in very limited scenarios. Display table, I saw a lot of people start using this. I think Gina was the first one that showed it to me. And basically, I can take some divs, I tell them to act like a table, and suddenly they lay out in a row. And it's sort of like an early version of limited Flexbox. So you get some of the problems of tables, you don't get the semantic issues, and you can do equal height columns and flexible layouts, and there's some nice things there. Sort of the low quality Flexbox. There's no margins on a table, so you have to switch to using border padding. There's all sorts of like weird little quirks about it, but there's a lot you can do. Kind of nifty, still a hack. Okay, we can use that. And then it was around this time, so people were playing with all these things, and that's when grid systems suddenly became a thing. This idea that we could have 12 columns, and gutters between them, so a column and a gutter there. And that's pulled out of the design world, and we're like, okay, we can try doing this on the web. Let's make systems that will do it. We want to be able to span a certain number of columns and gutters. So there's a span of 6. And the first one I remember, and as far as I recall, this was sort of the first open source CSS that I saw used on a massive scale. Lots of people starting to use the same libraries. I don't know if there were big ones before this, maybe Eric Meyer's Reset, but this was sort of the first big open sourcing of CSS tools. And you can see just some of the code here. Class-based spans floated left, margins on the right, and then you have to remove the margins on the last one. So you're putting margins on the right of every column, and then at the end you have to say, okay, this is the last one, remove that gutter. Classes are the API, and that makes sense. Classes are really the only API we have available to us in CSS. So if you're going to share CSS, classes are going to be the API. That was sort of the only option. And then you use it like this. We've all seen that. Column call 6 of 12 last. And you stack up these classes and you get your layout. It's clever. 960 grids came out a little bit later. And they said, okay, let's put the margins on both sides of this. And that gets rid of the last problem. Great, we've simplified it a little bit. Now we just say grid 6, and we get what we want. Clever, simpler. Object-oriented CSS was a little bit before that. Nicole Sullivan, who's here. And I think this is basically the entire grid system in OOCSS. So you can see it's much more compact. She got rid of the gutters, which simplifies the math way down, and I think is the most clever solution, and is what you can use now to avoid grid systems if you still want something like grids. So instead of exactly having columns, you have fractions, and you can just say span half of what's there. And without the gutters, that math is simple. It is actually a half. And then last unit in her system gives you that flexible overflow hidden last element. So it was nice to see these come out. It was sort of like we've got a lot of browser hacks when we're dealing with floats. We're doing 10 different hacks to get rid of the double margin bug, and you had to do the display inline, and there was sort of this chunk of code that you always had to do every time you floated something. And so grid systems made sense as a way to get rid of all of that and say, we'll simplify it down, we'll get it all in a system, and we'll go from there. So that was nice. It gives us also consistent patterns. Hey, I'm on topic finally. Oh, thank God. On the plus side, developers can ignore the CSS. On the downside, developers start ignoring the CSS. So that's a trade-off, depends on your situation. And a downside may be that you've got a third party locking you into a system that you didn't come up with and it's not designed for you specifically. And that can end up locking you in. As soon as you want to do something that the grid system hasn't planned for, you have to sometimes rip it out or just break it or find out ways to adapt. Often when you get to the edge of a system, it can get difficult. So it depends, and this never loads. Yeah, thank you, Rachel Smith. So it really depends on what your problems are and what you're trying to solve. Are you Mailforce? Are you Instaface? That's going to be, you're going to have to solve different problems there than I have to solve as a small agency doing client work. Are you running the pattern library for Hillary for president? That's going to be solving some different problems. You're working a lot faster on a big project. I'm not. I'm working on a small team. We don't have walls to throw code over. Everybody is talking to each other, and we're working on new projects for mid-sized companies, and they don't have the same concerns. So we have different constraints and different abilities, so we don't have to deal with some of the same things. I saw this talk by Natalie Down in 2008, and I found it really inspiring, and later I realized that's because she was also doing agency work at a small company doing these fast projects, and what we needed was not one system that was the same for every project, but a way of thinking about systems that we could adapt to each project. And that was more helpful than the toolkits themselves. So her idea was basically, let's have consistent ways of doing this and languages for it, but actually customize it every time. Yeah, basically Dave Rupert's tiny bootstraps for every client. I looked up Dave Rupert, and there's a spy. So I don't mean the spy, I mean the web developer. Yeah, Clear Left is an agency, that's where she was working. And so they had similar problems to us, and so I connected to her technique. And basically it started with answering a lot of questions about what kind of grid do we want? Is it going to be static, fluid, elastic, or some combination? Are we going to have equal columns or asymmetrical columns? How many of them? Where are the gutters, if there are any? If we can move the gutters into padding, that helps. And in what ways is it responsive? And her system involved making everything inside fluid and then putting an M-based container on it. And that meant you were responsive both to the viewport and to font sizes before we had media queries. It was pretty clever. It was sort of adaptive before responsive trademark. Yeah, fluid grids, elastic containers. I liked that it had project-defined restrictions. It was a system. You designed a system for your project, but you redesigned the system for each project. So you were coming up with something that would work for that specific site. Project-defined API as well, so you could design how much do we need to go with a class API, how much are we able to use semantic class names. That's a decision you can make depending on the project and the client and the size and how it's going to be used. The math, though, is ugly. And at that point, we didn't have Sass, but this is how you would do her system if you did have Sass. At that point, because we didn't have Sass, we were just copying and pasting in these numbers that make absolutely no sense. And it's ugly as hell. And I was just sitting there with a calculator doing this over and over. to get her grid system. The only reason it's complex is because of the gutters. They are what caused the problem. So I just wanted to make that prettier. Sass came out. I put a little framework around it. Now I've got something doing the math for me. Great. That's Susy. And that was the whole idea behind it. Just taking Natalie's system and, Natalie? Yes, Natalie. And putting it into a nicer package. This was the first version of it. If you remember the old Sass syntax, it's ugly. My brother had to do the commit because I didn't have a GitHub account at that point. I didn't know what open source was. He was like, maybe somebody will use this. And then I guess people did, and I'm sorry. And the advantage behind it was that you could sort of just develop any grid system on demand. You could create 960 fairly quickly. You could create Blueprint quickly. You could create OOCSS. It sort of didn't care what you were going to create. You would just create it for the project, and you'd have what you need. Grid systems are still overkill, which is an opinion. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't prep for this talk. I'm still getting used to it. Am I talking? Great. So I think grid systems are overkill, especially at this point. There's a lot of ways to avoid them. And now I remember this is the section where I teach you how to avoid them. Great. So grid systems, if they're fluid, that's the only time you've got the difficult math particularly. And this is the math problem that you're doing. Target, that's the width that we want to have, divided by the context. That's the width that we have by default. And we get the multiplier. We multiply that by 100%, and we have the percentage width that we want. And it's just that math problem over and over again. That's not highly complex algebra, but it's repetitive. So the target is our span. The context is how big could it span. And in Sass, we can simplify that actually to this. Percentage is target divided by context. And if we don't have gutters in the way, that's the whole thing. If you've been using something like Susy, where you say span 6 of 12, you could instead, without any library, tell Sass that you want percentage 6 of 12, and you'll get what you want. There's your grid system. That's the whole thing you need. You have to take the OOCSS approach where you don't have gutters between, because the gutters are what fuck up the math. You can also do it in pure CSS. If you're happy using calc, you can do calc target divided by context. You can do calc 3 of 12, and you'll get 3 columns out of 12 on your grid system. You don't need my tools for this. It's built right in. Just don't put gutters in, because gutters are going to ruin it. And at this point, we can finally put gutters, and when I say finally, I mean it was like in 2007 that we could do this. We can finally put gutters inside as padding because we are able to fix the box model. The reason we started with paddings in the margins is because the box model was broken. So now that it's fixed, we can get rid of the gutters, take them out of the math, and just do this. There's a DIY grid system with no library. So it's sort of Natalie's idea combined with Nicole's idea, combined with Susy's idea, and then without any of them. It works with any technique that's just getting you a width. You can put that width on a margin or on an element, or you can use it with floats, you can use it with Flexbox, you can use it with display table. You could use it with grids, but it wouldn't be worthwhile. And you can add padding where you need it. Starting to play with custom properties, which I started playing with earlier. Custom properties look like this. They're basically an empty browser prefix. So this is -WebKit, but without the WebKit. And you can give it any name, and then you can give it any value. and you have your own custom properties. And then you can access them using the var function, var the property you want, and then any fallbacks in case that property isn't set. Support's pretty good for this, unless you're dealing with older versions of Internet Explorer. But there's fairly good support. And you can do something like this. Here's a grid system where you can use your old language. The variable span divided by the variable columns times 100%. It's that same math problem. You can put it in there like that. Calc is supported even more. And we get inheritance and media queries for free in our grid system, which is something that no Sass grid system or CSS grid system can do in quite the same way, because properties inherit, and these properties also inherit. So I can say there are actually more columns available at a larger size, and that will trickle down to everything. Everything will understand that those new columns are available, and that variable will change value at the different sizes or in different contexts, which is very handy. This is the entire grid system if you want something like this. And you can sort of create a mix-in with it where you tell the width to use that value if it's valid. And so if nothing is set, the width won't be set. It will use initial. But if you set a span in columns and the math works, you'll get a new width from it. And then you would use it like this. Just span 1. And again, you can use that with any system or any technique for layout, floats or Flexbox or whatever. You can do the same with gutters. So I like that. It's plain old CSS. It's very little code. It's very lightweight. It understands the DOM. It can respond to inheritance. That's handy. We still have sort of explicit grids, which I still think is overkill, because really, I don't want 12 equal columns. I want relationships that are going to move and change depending on various contexts. And that's why I think grid systems are overkill. We still would rather have implicit relationships, and we're still dealing with explicit ones. So Flexbox is the first time we get to actually play with these implicit relationships in a layout. The support there is very good. You can use it a lot of places. It's finally not a hack. This is the first time we've talked about anything that's not a hack. It's a lot of fun to play with if you haven't already. It's kind of like floats mixed with display table. It's like a cross between the two. You can do a lot more. It's all about relationships. It's about setting how big is this compared to this other thing? How do they change sizes in relation to each other? Defining implicit relationships is the entire point. So if I say I want this one to grow twice as fast as the others, and I want it to shrink at the same rate as some others, that's not actually, so it would be, you could set it to 3 and one's at 2, and they would sort of grow in relation to those ratios. And you can set sort of like, an ideal size would be around 20 ems, and then I'd like it to grow and shrink from there. And I like that. We sort of set, here's a suggestion, and then here's how to move. Here's the relationships. We can start doing things like justify content, space between, or there's some sort of space equal. I don't remember what that was called. And we get distributed white space. We can do vertical centering. We can do equal height columns. We're only dealing with a single axis, which isn't ideal for layouts. And what I mean by that is sort of like floats. They stack up in one direction, and then you cut to the next line, and then they stack up in one direction. You're not doing anything on the vertical axis. You can change which axis you're dealing with. You can do it in any direction, but only one at a time. So there's no alignment across the rows there. You're only dealing with how they flex in the row. You can do row reverse, which lets you change what axis you're on. You can stretch things to get cross-axis alignment. You can do equal height and vertical centering, which I already said. And you can change the order, which can be handy. You can say, well, actually, I want this to be first, even though something else is first in source order. That's a useful trick. Nesting matters too much. This is the big downside from floats. Suddenly, all those extra divs that JavaScript is giving me are actually in the way because Flexbox only works with immediate siblings in a parent container. So don't love that, but I get lots of relationships and control. Flexbox has poor performance on full pages. It has to figure out the layout slowly based on the content that's loading inside of it. So things move around while the page is loading. It's a little bit slow figuring that out. That's not great. It works much better on internal elements. And then finally, we get to CSS grids. Yeah, OMG. I don't know why I gave the rest of the talk. This is game-changing. This is actual real layouts in the web, in the browser. I've heard people saying, oh, it's just like tables, or it's just something, we could have done this. There's not another way. There's no polyfills. Nothing can do grid like grid does grid. So this is really a new thing. It sort of all landed at once in most of the browsers. It was like sometime in March, I think. Suddenly I woke up one weekend and I was like, oh, all the browsers support grid. That's fun. It's still not universally supported, but it does have a lot of green there. And there is nothing like it. So the specs is pretty complex, and some talks you'll hear or articles you'll read try to explain the entire spec, and it can look overwhelming. There is a lot of power in there. There's a lot of options. But it doesn't have to be complex to get started. There's a lot you can do with just a couple simple ideas. So you would use display grid to set up a grid. You define the grid on the container element, and then the children follow that grid. So grid template columns. There's your simple 12-column grid. Repeat 12 one fraction. You can set how it creates rows. You can set gutters between things, and they don't ruin the math because you're not doing the math. Someone else is. A quick thing to know about the fraction unit, that's a new unit for grids. Percentages define a fraction of the total space. Viewport width or viewport height define a fraction of the viewport. So percentages would be the space available, so that's within whatever container. Viewport width would be a percentage of the full viewport, the size of the browser. And fraction defines a percentage of remaining space. So it's in this layout, we have this much extra white space. What should we do with it? And fraction, similar to flex grow or flex shrink, allows you to say how much of that remaining space should we use, or how do we relatively flex to take up that space. By default, one fraction actually means min-max auto one fraction, which can be very confusing because sometimes auto is huge. So it's very common that you'll need to set min-max 0 one fraction or something like that to give a min width to it for it to start from. So it's not thinking it has to stay a minimum of a huge amount. Grid works like this. Basically, you've got grid lines. They're one indexed, so the first one is called 1. Then you've got grid line 2, 3, 4, 5. Same down with row lines. You can also negative one index, so you can say negative 4, 3, 2, 1, negative 1, 2, 3, 4, so you can attach something to the end. You've got column and row gaps. Those are between the columns and the rows. Those are your gutters. And then you can start placing items on the grid using this syntax, which looks a lot like spans. Well, so first you're telling it where to start. Grid column 1 will start at the first line, and then it will go to the fourth line. Or grid row, we've got 2. It will start at the second line, and then we can span 2, and we'll end up wherever we end up with, addition, whatever math things. So that's all it is. You can do the same thing with the negative indexing, which attaches to the ends. And this is your beautiful layout, which I made for you. Isn't that great? I know that's what you were looking for. You can do it. But even cooler than that, for getting started, you can have named grid areas, because you likely, unless you've listened to Jen Simmons, you're building something boring like this, where you've got a header and a footer and a nav and a main area. And you can do something like that very quickly with grid. This is the whole layout. You just do this ASCII art of the layout you want. I want there to be a header up top, and then nav and main, and then footer and footer. And then you can tell each element which area it goes into. So with just that code, we get the layout that we want. Wow, that's a jump. Okay. So the thing that I started playing with this on a project recently is using custom properties with grid to pass in raw data and use it to do a layout. So this is it. This is a scheduling app, and we have a grid row for every minute of the day, or a grid column for every minute of the day, and then we pass in that this one starts at minute 30 and has a duration of 60, and it just automatically lays out because we've put that into the grid column start and grid column end. I have an article on CSS tricks about more that you can do with that, passing raw data in and then using grids to take that raw data and turn it into charts or whatever. I did this with a definition list. I think you could also do it fairly simply with tables. There's a lot of power there. The colors are also controlled by that raw data. So it's a really cool thing about custom properties. You start passing raw data into your CSS, and you can do a lot. We finally have 2 dimensions. This works on both axes. That's what we've wanted. So we can align things in columns and rows, which is a whole new way of thinking about web layout. We've got flexible markup order. We can backfill space, have things fill in the empty spaces or put it in whatever order we need. Put our footer first, because that'll be great and accessible. On the downside, nesting still matters. We're waiting on a couple properties that will help fix that. One is display contents, which will basically allow a container to disappear and just promote its children. Or subgrid, which will allow grandchildren elements to access their grandparent grid, which is not possible right now. So that's a little bit of a limitation at this point, but the fixes are coming. There's all kinds of cool shit you can do in here. You can have it autofill, you can have it backfill, you can name the lines and then have sort of implicit areas that overlap. You can define autogrids that sort of generate a grid for you based on some constraints, based on even the content that's in them. It's very cool. If you want to see more of this, go to gridbyexample.com. Rachel Andrew and Jen Simmons have done amazing work here. And this doesn't just include all the tutorials that you need. They've given you layout templates that you can copy and paste, and they include the fallback code that you'll need for old browsers. You can get your entire layout from their website. So with Grid, we basically just snap, 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 snap. We get a website. We wear our helmet because there's dragons. And, I guess this is the helmet maybe. Use supports for fallbacks. It works like a media query, except it checks the validity of a statement or whether the browser understands that statement. If the browser understands display grid, it will do what's in there. You'll want your fallback outside of that so that it's likely browsers that don't support @supports also don't support grid. So you'll want that code outside and then the grid code inside. And for me, grid make things so easy that it's like the fact that I have to do a fallback for it, I'm like, so what? I spent 5 minutes designing the layout. It's okay if I spend another couple hours defining a fallback. It's not like I'm spending several hours on both. The grid really makes things easy and we're all getting fired. So I just start with CSS Grid now. Doesn't matter what browsers I'm supporting, start with Grid. It goes quickly. You can get a layout very fast and very powerful, and then you can start dealing with how it's going to fall back. Yeah, I said we're going to get fired. Fix the box model. That's still useful. Stay in the flow. Think dynamically. How are these relationships working? Take away the gutters. That helps with your math, unless you're using CSS Grid. And then, whatever, leave those gutters in there. Live a little. And I have to put this in there just for Jen Simmons, who is tired of your 12-column grids. And I agree with her. The world is ready for more than 12 columns. And I don't mean 24. That's not. If you want to take it too far, I figured out how to use custom properties to rebuild all of Susy in plain CSS. This is not something you should ever use. Like if you were already not using Susy, extra don't use this. There's absolutely no reason for it, but it is fun to know that custom properties can do this. You can basically create functions. There's one limitation, which is that every function works once per element, which is that's a limitation. You don't need this. You can build that. If you do need grids and you want to use a system like this, you might as well do the 3-line build your own version. You don't need the full power here. But there it is. See, it works. So, great. I'm sorry, web. Thank you.
So my first question is about the process of writing layouts for you now. So now with Grid, what does that process look like and how do you test for fallbacks?
Yeah, actually, testing for fallbacks is the interesting part of that question to me. The process is basically that I look at the design and I figure out if Grid is going to be useful for it. Are there layout areas on 2 axes, basically, that are going to need something like this? Mm-hmm. I do the CSS Grid version quickly, and then I move on to dealing with the fallback. There's not a good way to just tell a browser to turn off your support of grids. So
yeah, I wish there was sometimes.
So you kind of have to go through and comment out all of your display grid properties. And if you comment out display grid, none of the other properties have any effect. So that's the quick way to do it. You don't have to get rid of all of your grid code. The other thing to remember there is that means you can put less things in @supports because you can just change the display property and it will change which other properties it's using.
Okay, cool. Do you ever use Browser Stack or any of those applications?
Yeah, sometimes.
Yeah.
And then you get into the dev tools in that and see what's not working. And I mean, the fallbacks, you're basically doing the same things you were always doing, so you know the rules and where it's going to break. And
totally. I like that you mentioned the name template areas because that's basically your design.
Yeah.
You just draw it on there. I like to use emoji because it's you can see head for the header and feet for the footer, and it's one letter, so you can align it like
clever.
A grid. So I love doing that. What was the weirdest thing about CSS that you discovered when you were just learning? There's a lot of weirdness that you mentioned.
Yeah, the weirdest. I mean, it was probably figuring out how to do layouts. I just, they were absurd at that point. And tables weren't better, but CSS, you were like, why am I using this float thing that's designed for pushing images to the side? Why is that what I have to use for doing a layout?
Yeah. And I also want to ask you what your favorite CSS hack is of all of them.
Well, of all the hacks, the clear fix is probably the most useful.
Yeah, that's a practical answer.
Yeah, that's a really practical, and like that's the one that I still use. I think most of the other hacks I've been able to get rid of, and that one is still there.
All right, nice. Thank you, Miriam.
Thank you.
We're going to go right into our next speaker, so thank you.